Ethan Caldwell raised his champagne glass and smiled at the table full of witnesses he had personally selected for this moment. "To finally being free," he said, loud enough for the entire private dining room to hear, "of dead weight." Emily Harper sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her face the color of someone who had been struck but refused to fall. The divorce papers lay between them on the white tablecloth like a wound. She did not cry. She did not argue. She picked up the pen, signed her name in her usual careful handwriting, and set it back down without a word. Ethan laughed. His friends laughed. His girlfriend Vanessa leaned over and kissed his jaw. Nobody at that table understood that they had just watched a woman decide to stop being patient. If this story made you feel something, hit the like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The dinner had been Ethan's idea from the beginning, not just the restaurant, though he had chosen Auberge, a private dining club on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, the kind of place where the cheapest bottle of wine costs more than most people's monthly car payment. Not just the guest list either, though he had been careful about that, inviting the 8 people whose opinions mattered most to his professional image. 2 board members from his company, a commercial real estate attorney named Davis, who handled his private transactions, a venture capitalist named Gerald Park, who had been circling a potential deal with Ethan for months, and 4 friends from his MBA years who had watched him climb and who he needed to see this moment clearly. He had thought about the seating arrangement for 2 days. He had made sure Emily would be placed directly across from him, close enough that he could watch her face. That was the part he had looked forward to most. Ethan Caldwell was 44 years old, and he had built his career on reading rooms. He could walk into a boardroom and know within 90 seconds who was nervous, who was performing confidence, who actually had the numbers, and who was bluffing. He had a talent for identifying weakness and pressing on it at precisely the right moment, not hard enough to break the negotiation, just hard enough to remind the other person who was in control. His company, Caldwell Meridian Holdings, had grown from a real estate investment boutique into a mid-tier private equity operation with $112 million in assets under management. He had done that himself, he believed, through intelligence and nerve and an absolute refusal to let sentiment get in the way of good decisions. Emily had been a sentiment. He had finally decided that clearly. They had met 12 years ago at a fundraising dinner for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, which was ironic because Ethan hated classical music and had only attended because a client had given him the tickets. Emily was sitting at a round table near the back, not trying to be noticed, talking to an elderly woman in a blue dress about something that had them both laughing quietly. She was wearing a green wrap dress, and her dark hair was pulled back simply, and she looked entirely out of place among the women in that room who wore their jewelry like armor. He had found her interesting. Later he found out her last name was Harper. Her father was some kind of retired cattle rancher out in Montana, she said. He had never pressed for more than that. In the early years, Emily had been good for him in ways he never articulated out loud, but understood practically. She was calm when he was volatile. She was steady in rooms where he needed steadiness. She remembered names, birthdays, the personal details of clients' lives that Ethan filed away as irrelevant, but that turned out, more than once, to matter enormously when a deal was wobbling. She handled the social architecture of their life with a competence he mistook for simplicity. What he saw when he looked at her, by the end of 12 years, was a woman who made no noise, who had no career of her own worth mentioning. She did something with financial consulting, independent work, but nothing that produced an income he ever paid attention to. Who dressed conservatively and spoke quietly and never once demanded to be the most important person in the room. He had grown embarrassed by her quietness without ever examining why. His world had gotten louder and more expensive, and Emily had not grown louder with it. Vanessa Reed had. Vanessa was 36, a corporate communications strategist with a corner office at a firm that managed the public image of 5 Fortune 500 companies. She was the kind of woman who walked into rooms expecting them to rearrange themselves around her, and they usually did. She wore red the way some women wore armor. She had opinions about his company that were sharp and well-reasoned, and she delivered them without apologizing, and Ethan found that intoxicating after years of what he had decided was Emily's passivity. He had been with Vanessa for 8 months before he told Emily. He had arranged the divorce through his personal attorney, a man named Preston Briggs, who had been handling Ethan's more sensitive legal matters for 6 years, and who understood that when Ethan said he wanted something done quietly and efficiently, he meant it. The financial architecture of the settlement was Briggs's most careful work. Ethan's disclosed assets represented roughly 40% of his actual holdings. The rest had been moved months earlier through a sequence of shell structures that Briggs had designed: a Delaware LLC that held a property portfolio, 2 overseas accounts, and an interest in a private fund that didn't appear in any document bearing Ethan's name directly. Emily would receive the marital home, a 4-bedroom house in Lincoln Park that had a mortgage she would struggle to service on her consulting income, along with a settlement figure that looked reasonable on paper and was, in Briggs's confident assessment, airtight. Emily had not contested a single point. That had surprised Briggs, who had braced for a fight. It had surprised Ethan, too, though he had reframed it quickly as confirmation of what he already believed. She didn't have the intelligence to see what had been hidden, or the spine to fight for it if she did. She had signed the final documents in a downtown attorney's office on a Tuesday afternoon in March with her own lawyer, a quiet woman named Ms. Delaney, who had asked 3 questions during the entire proceeding and then said nothing further, sitting beside her. Emily had thanked Briggs politely as she left. She had not looked at Ethan. That had bothered him slightly. He had wanted her to look at him. The dinner at Auberge was his solution to that. A celebration, he told his guests. New chapter. He had reserved the private room 6 weeks in advance, ordered the wine list personally, and arranged for Emily to receive an invitation through a mutual acquaintance, framed as a professional farewell dinner, a chance to part with civility in front of people who mattered. He knew she would come because Emily always behaved correctly in social situations. That was one of her few consistent qualities. She arrived at 7:15, 5 minutes after everyone else, which he suspected she had timed deliberately. She was wearing a navy dress he hadn't seen before, her hair down, small gold earrings. She looked, he thought with a faint irritation he couldn't account for, completely composed. She greeted his board members by name. She asked Gerald Park about his daughter's college applications, because she had remembered from a dinner 18 months earlier that the girl had been looking at Northwestern. Park's face did something warm and surprised, and he talked to Emily for 4 minutes about his daughter before Ethan managed to redirect the conversation. They sat down. The courses came. Ethan had arranged the speeches for after the 3rd course or over dessert wine. He stood up and tapped his glass. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he said. "Most of you have known me long enough to watch me make a few mistakes." He paused for the laugh he knew would come. "Tonight, I'm celebrating the correction of the longest-running one." He looked directly at Emily across the table. "Emily, I want to publicly acknowledge that you were a perfectly adequate partner for the years we had. But some of us are built for bigger things than adequate. I hope you find whatever smaller life suits you." The room was not comfortable. 2 of the MBA friends laughed because they were nervous and didn't know what else to do. Gerald Park looked down at his dessert. One of the board members, a woman named Claire Hutchins, who Ethan had always found slightly difficult to manage, set her fork down with a precise, quiet click and looked at Emily. Emily picked up her wine glass and took a small sip and set it back down without any change in her expression. "Thank you, Ethan," she said. "I hope the same for you." That was all. No trembling voice, no reddening, no sharp retort. She looked at him the way you look at something you've already made a decision about, and then she turned to Claire Hutchins and asked a question about an exhibition at the Art Institute, and the conversation moved, and Ethan stood there a moment longer than he meant to before sitting back down. Vanessa squeezed his hand under the table. "Ignore her," she murmured. "She's trying to play dignified." Ethan nodded, but the satisfaction he had planned for that moment hadn't quite arrived, and he spent the rest of the dinner waiting for it and not finding it. Emily drove home alone in the March cold, the city smearing past the windows in orange and white. She was not crying. She had not cried in 4 months, since the night she had sat at her kitchen table with a glass of water and a yellow legal pad, and written down every number she actually knew about Ethan's financial situation and compared it to every number he had declared in the divorce proceedings. The gap between those 2 columns had taken her breath away briefly, and then she had exhaled and picked up her phone and called her father. William Harper answered on the 2nd ring. It was 9:30 in Montana, and she could hear wind through the phone the way she always could when he was standing outside on the porch. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Go ahead," her father said. She told him the numbers, all of them. She told him what Briggs had built and how it was structured and why it would be almost impossible to challenge through conventional legal channels. She had spent 3 weeks doing the research herself before she made the call, because she needed to be sure she understood exactly what she was dealing with before she asked anyone else to look at it. William Harper was quiet for a long time after she finished. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Nothing," Emily said. "For now." "For now," he repeated. "I need him to believe he won," she said, "completely. If he thinks there's any threat, he'll move things again and bury them deeper. I need him comfortable." Her father made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You sound like your grandfather." "I take that as a compliment." "It was," William said. "I'll make some calls in the morning." Emily thanked him and hung up and finished her glass of water and went to bed. She slept 6 hours, which was more than she had expected. Here is the thing about William Harper that nobody who met him in ordinary circumstances would have guessed. He was not a retired rancher. He owned a ranch, 4,000 acres in the Clark Fork Valley, cattle, horses, 2 ranch hands named Jose and Mick who had worked for him for over 20 years. That was real. He genuinely preferred blue jeans to suits and drove a 12-year-old truck and kept a vegetable garden behind the main house that he tended personally. All of that was also real. What was not widely known was the other thing. William Harper had spent 30 years building a private investment infrastructure that operated almost entirely outside public visibility. It was not a fund in any conventional sense. It was a network, patient capital moving through carefully maintained relationships, strategic positions in regional banks, minority stakes in holding companies, board seats on institutions that sounded unglamorous but controlled the financial plumbing of significant portions of the American economy. Midwestern agricultural banks, a regional commercial insurance group, 3 mid-sized logistics companies whose contracts supported supply chains that nobody thought about until they stopped working. An interest in a private credit firm that provided financing to businesses that couldn't access conventional lending and who paid accordingly for that access. The total picture of what William Harper controlled, if you could even assemble it, which almost nobody could, was somewhere north of $4 billion. Not all of it his, much of it managed on behalf of families he had known for decades, old money that moved quietly and wanted to stay that way. But enough of it his that the number, when Emily had finally asked him directly at age 32, had made her sit down. He had never told Ethan. Emily had never told Ethan. It was not a secret exactly. It was simply information William had never found a reason to offer, and Ethan had never found a reason to ask. Ethan had met Emily's father 4 times in 12 years of marriage. He found William politely dull, the way certain men find quiet people dull because silence registers to them as absence. He had described William once to a friend as a simple guy, Montana background, doesn't really track with what we do. He had meant it as nothing. He simply hadn't thought about it much after that. This was, as it turned out, the central error of Ethan Caldwell's life. Now, the first 90 days after the divorce were exactly what Ethan had imagined they would be. He and Vanessa moved into a leased penthouse in River North while his Lincoln Park property sold. He'd kept the second home in Wilmette and 2 investment properties, at least on paper, and the penthouse felt appropriately triumphant for this stage of things. He had dinner with Gerald Park and moved the investment conversation forward. He closed a deal on a mixed-use development in the western suburbs that he had been negotiating for 8 months. He bought a car he had wanted for 3 years. Vanessa was good at this life. She was good at the restaurants and the events and the particular performance of having arrived that Ethan needed from his personal life. She knew people and she introduced him to more people, and she was aggressive about protecting his image in ways that Emily had never been. Emily had always found reputation management vaguely distasteful, which Ethan had once found charmingly principled and now recognized as a professional liability. He thought about Emily occasionally, not with longing, he was clear on that point with himself, but with a faint curiosity about what she was doing, whether she was struggling with the mortgage, whether she had found some smaller life, the way he had suggested. He had driven past the Lincoln Park house once in late April without intending to and found himself slowing down and then feeling irritated at himself and accelerating again. He mentioned it to no one. In May, his quarterly investment report showed the portfolio performing slightly below projections. Briggs attributed it to market softness, which was broadly true and broadly reasonable, and Ethan accepted the explanation and redirected his attention to the new development deal. In June, something happened that was strange enough to register briefly. A regional bank in Illinois that handled the depository accounts for two of his shell entities, a routine banking relationship he had held for 4 years, sent notification of account suspension pending a compliance review. His operations manager, a careful woman named Sandra Ogle, who had been with the company for 6 years, flagged it, and Ethan told her to have Briggs handle it. Briggs made 3 calls and reported back that the bank had recently undergone a change in ownership structure and was conducting reviews of all business accounts as part of the transition. Standard procedure. It would be resolved in 60 days. It was not resolved in 60 days. In July, Gerald Park called to say he needed to delay the investment discussion indefinitely. He was apologetic and vague. Internal restructuring on our end, timing issues, nothing personal. And Ethan spent 2 days after the call trying to figure out what had changed. He couldn't identify it. Park had been enthusiastic as recently as 3 weeks earlier. Also in July, a commercial real estate firm that had been in due diligence to acquire Ethan's Western Suburbs development, a deal that would have produced a 14% return on the 8 months of work he had invested, notified him through their attorney that they were withdrawing from the process. No explanation that satisfied. Their stated reasoning was financing conditions, which Ethan's own real estate contacts told him was implausible given current lending rates. Briggs came to the office and sat across from Ethan in the gray chair by the window that clients used and looked at his notes and said, "It might be coincidence." "It's not coincidence," Ethan said. "Then someone has a position against you, or a relationship with parties in these transactions that's influencing decisions." "Who?" Briggs spread his hands. "I'm looking." Michin. Ethan went to see Sandra Ogle, who had the institutional memory of the company in a way nobody else did. She had been tracking the anomalies on her own because that was her nature, and she had printed them out in a timeline that she spread across his desk when he sat down across from her. The bank suspension, Gerald Park's withdrawal, the development deal collapsing. A smaller thing she hadn't flagged initially. A property management firm that handled 3 of the buildings in his private portfolio had sent a notice that they were terminating service agreements, citing strategic reorientation of service focus, a vendor he had used for 12 years. "Is there a pattern?" Ethan asked. Sandra was 61 and had seen enough business environments to have permanently calibrated her expressions toward neutral. She looked at the timeline and then at him and said, "It looks like someone is applying pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Supplier level, banking level, deal flow level. That's a coordinated campaign." "It looks coordinated," Sandra said carefully. "I can't confirm that." "But it's not a market downturn. It's not bad timing." "No," she said. "It doesn't look like that." Ethan stared at the timeline. Who has that kind of reach to move in banking, property management, and institutional investment simultaneously? Sandra said nothing because she didn't have an answer, and she was not the kind of person to fill silence with noise. Ethan drove home that night thinking about enemies. He had some, everyone in his position did, but he had always managed those relationships with enough professional distance that direct sabotage seemed unlikely. He thought about clients he had disappointed, partners he had squeezed, deals he had structured in ways that benefited him and disadvantaged others. There were examples, but none of them had this kind of institutional weight. He fell asleep thinking about it and woke up at 3 a.m. with a thought he immediately dismissed, and then couldn't entirely dismiss. He lay in the dark for an hour and a half thinking about how many times in 12 years of marriage he had asked Emily detailed questions about her father's professional background. He counted 2. He came up with 2. Once at a dinner party where someone had asked, and he had said some kind of investment background, cattle and land, Montana, and moved on. Once, early in their marriage, when a tax matter had required him to document family financial relationships, and Emily had said her father had some private holdings, and he had filed that away as a standard wealthy parent situation, and thought nothing more about it. He thought about Emily at that dinner, signing the papers without looking up, not crying, thanking Briggs politely. He got up and went to his home office and opened his laptop and typed William Harper Montana Investment into a search engine. He found almost nothing. A brief mention in a 20-year-old Montana Business Quarterly article about agricultural investment in the Clark Fork region. A property record. A filing with the state. Almost nothing. Ethan stared at the screen. In his experience, when you searched a person's name and found almost nothing, it meant one of two things. They were genuinely unimportant, or they were the kind of important that worked very hard not to be findable. He closed the laptop and didn't sleep again until nearly dawn. 10. He called Emily 3 days later. He hadn't spoken to her since the dinner at Auberge. She answered on the third ring. Ethan. I wanted to see how you were doing, he said, which was not why he was calling and which she almost certainly knew. I'm fine, Emily said. Her voice was the same as it always had been, measured even. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. The voice of someone who was being accurate. Good. I'm glad to hear it. He paused. I've been having some strange professional things lately. Some disruptions. Probably nothing. I'm sorry to hear that. I was wondering if you'd had any recent contact with your father, Bill, William. There was a pause. I talk to my father regularly, yes. Has he mentioned anything about business in Chicago, investments, that kind of thing? Another pause, slightly longer. My father doesn't really talk about that kind of thing with me, she said. Right, Ethan said. Of course. He waited for something, some change in her tone, some tell. There was nothing. Well, just thought I'd reach out. Take care of yourself, Ethan, Emily said, and ended the call. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. The phrase she'd used, take care of yourself, had a quality he couldn't quite categorize. Not threatening, not mocking. Something more like careful neutrality that contained something underneath it that he couldn't read. He called Briggs and told him to dig harder. What Briggs found over the following 6 weeks was this. The regional bank that had suspended his accounts had been quietly acquired 18 months earlier by a holding company registered in Delaware. That holding company had 3 officers on record, none of whose names appeared in any other business context that Briggs could easily trace. A forensic financial consultant Briggs brought in took another 2 weeks and found that the Delaware holding company had received its initial capital from a private credit fund based in Wyoming. The Wyoming fund had 15 limited partners, none named publicly. The general partner was an entity called Clearwater Capital Advisors. Briggs set the printout on Ethan's desk. Clearwater Capital Advisors, he said. There is no public-facing operation by that name. No website, no press, no filings beyond state registration. Registered in Montana. Ethan looked at the page for a long time. Montana, he said. Clark Fork area, Briggs said quietly. The silence in the office was the kind that has weight to it. He owns the bank, Ethan said. He has a controlling position in the entity that acquired it, yes. Through 4 layers of holding structures. 5, actually, Briggs said, and the structure didn't form specifically for this. It's been in place for years. Decades, possibly. Ethan pushed back from his desk and walked to the window. 42 floors up, Chicago spread itself out below him in all directions, indifferent and enormous. He stood there for a while without saying anything. The development deal, he finally said. The firm that pulled out has a financing relationship with a private credit provider. I haven't confirmed the chain definitively, but the signature characteristics of the structure are consistent. Gerald Park. Briggs was quiet. Gerald Park's fund, Ethan said. Does Park have a limited partnership relationship with anything traceable to... We're still looking. Ethan turned from the window. His face had done something that Briggs, who had seen many faces in difficult moments, found slightly unsettling. Not anger exactly, but a quality of comprehension that was arriving too late and arriving all at once. He's been in my company's financial environment for years, Ethan said. Emily's father, and I never looked. I never once actually looked. Briggs said nothing because there was nothing useful to say to that. She knew, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. I can't determine what Mrs. Caldwell... She knew what he had, Ethan said. She knew the whole time. He stopped. She sat across that table and signed those papers, and she knew. He thought about her face at Auberge, the complete absence of distress in it. He had read it as resignation, as the quiet defeat of a woman who understood she had lost. He understood now that it had been something else entirely. the specific stillness of someone who has already made all the necessary arrangements and is simply waiting for time to pass. "What do I do?" he asked. It came out differently than he intended. Smaller. Briggs picked up his briefcase. "I think," he said carefully, "that we need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before we consider options." He paused at the door. "Ethan, I've been your attorney for 6 years. I need you to know that some of what I helped you structure in the divorce, the financial arrangements, if those are examined carefully by the right people, there could be significant exposure." Ethan looked at him. "Are you telling me that I should be worried about my own attorney?" "I'm telling you," Briggs said, "to think carefully about who has been looking at your records, and for how long, and what they may already know." He held Ethan's gaze for a moment. "I'll be in touch." The door closed behind him with a sound that seemed, in the silence that followed, considerably larger than it actually was. Ethan stood in his office for a long time after Briggs left. The city went on below him, enormous and indifferent, doing exactly what it had always done. He thought about all the rooms he had ever walked into and read correctly, all the negotiations he had controlled by understanding where the power actually lived. He thought about 12 years of dinners and mornings and conversations, and a woman who had sat across from him at those dinners and heard those conversations and said almost nothing, who had thanked his attorney politely on the day she signed the divorce papers, who had told him, when he called 3 days ago, to take care of himself in a voice that contained nothing he could read. He thought about how long it takes to build something that nobody can see. He picked up his phone. He set it back down. He picked it up again and stood there holding it. And outside the window, the Chicago afternoon went on without him. And somewhere in Montana, a man he had never bothered to understand was doing whatever it was he did at the end of a day. And somewhere in this city, a woman he had dismissed as ordinary was living a life he had never once thought to ask about. Ethan Caldwell stood in his 42-floor office in the middle of the city he had always considered his territory, and for the first time in a very long time, he had no idea what to do next. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon from the bottle he kept in the lower left drawer of his desk, a habit he had developed in his late 30s and justified as the prerogative of men who worked the hours he worked, and he sat down and drank it slowly and tried to think clearly. The first thing he needed was information. Real information, not the partial picture Briggs had assembled. He needed to understand the actual scope of William Harper's position in his financial environment before he could make any rational decision about how to respond. He called a contact at a Chicago-based due diligence firm, a man named Roy Esterhaus, who did the kind of research that didn't appear on invoices with specific line items, and told him he needed a full profile on William Carter Harper, Montana, as quickly as possible. "How deep?" Roy asked. "Everything you can find," Ethan said. "Everything that exists." Roy called back in 4 days. He did not deliver the report over the phone. He came to the office in person, which Ethan had not requested and which Roy apparently considered necessary. And he sat in the gray chair by the window and put a bound document on the desk and said, "I want to be straightforward with you. This is the most complicated individual financial picture I've encountered in 22 years of this work." Ethan opened the document. Roy talked him through it. 20 minutes. By the end, Ethan's bourbon glass had been empty for 15 minutes, and he hadn't moved to refill it. The number Roy arrived at, qualified, partial, almost certainly incomplete, was somewhere between $3 and $5 billion in controlled assets. Not net worth in the conventional sense, capital under control, through direct ownership, partnership positions, and what Roy described as informal influence relationships with regional financial institutions across 7 states. 7 states, Ethan repeated. "That I could confirm," Roy said. "There are likely more." "And he's been in Illinois how long?" "The earliest Illinois-connected entity I found dates to 1987, Roy said. 37 years ago. He was," Roy checked his notes, "31 years old." Ethan sat with that for a moment. He had turned 44 in February. William Harper had been building his invisible infrastructure since before Ethan was old enough to vote. "There's one more thing," Roy said. He turned to a page near the back of the document. "This is speculative. I want to be clear about that." "Go ahead." "The pattern of activity I was able to track, specifically the acceleration of certain transactions and position adjustments beginning approximately 8 months ago, is consistent with a deliberate campaign. The timing correlates with your divorce proceedings." 8 months ago was when Ethan had told Emily he wanted a divorce. Roy closed his notebook and stood up. "I don't know what your situation is with this family," he said, "and I'm not asking, but whoever you're dealing with has been doing this for a very long time, and they are very good at it, and they have been paying attention to you for longer than you've been paying attention to them." He picked up his briefcase. "My invoice will come through the usual channel." After Roy left, Ethan sat alone with the bound document and his empty glass, and the particular silence of an office building in the late afternoon when most of the staff has gone home. He turned pages without fully reading them. His mind kept returning to a single image. Emily at their kitchen table in the Lincoln Park house years ago. He couldn't place exactly when, some unremarkable weeknight, sitting with a legal pad and a laptop, working on something she described as client projections. He had walked through the kitchen to get water and glanced at the screen and seen columns of numbers that looked more complex than what he'd have expected from a small consulting practice. And she had tilted the screen slightly without being obvious about it and asked if he wanted coffee, and he had said no and kept walking. He had kept walking. He closed the document and looked out the window at the city going dark below him, the lights coming on one by one across the grid, and he thought about all the things you can build in the negative space of someone else's arrogance, and all the years they spend not looking at you. Vanessa noticed something was wrong within 48 hours. She was perceptive in the way that people who manage other people's public images are perceptive. She read behavioral signals the way a trader reads market signals, quickly and without sentiment. "You're distracted," she said one evening, standing in the kitchen of the River North penthouse in her work clothes, poured wine in one hand, watching him the way she watched client problems. Not just stressed, distracted. Something shifted. "Business complications," he said. "The bank thing? Related to that?" She was quiet for a moment. "Is it the divorce? Is Emily doing something?" "No," he said, which was not technically inaccurate in the sense she meant it. Vanessa set her wine down. "Ethan, I've built 3 executive reputations from worse positions than whatever this is. You don't have to manage this alone." He looked at her. She was smart and capable, and she genuinely believed she could help him because she understood the version of the problem she knew about, and he had a very clear sense, sitting there, that the version she knew about was so much smaller than the actual problem that her help would be the equivalent of offering a Band-Aid for a structural fracture. He couldn't tell her the truth without explaining what Briggs had helped him structure in the divorce, and that was not a conversation he could have. "I know," he said. "Thank you." She studied him for another moment and then picked her wine back up and let it go, because she had enough professional instinct to know when someone was closing a door. They ate dinner largely in silence, and Ethan spent the meal sitting across from her in the apartment he was paying $11,000 a month for, and thinking about what it cost to be seen and what it cost not to be, and which of those bills was harder to pay in the end. Well, in September, 3 things happened in the same week. The first, Caldwell Meridian Holdings lost its primary institutional lender. The firm had maintained a revolving credit facility with a regional commercial bank that provided operational liquidity for deal structures, a standard arrangement, in place for 9 years, never a problem. The bank's new compliance department, it had undergone the same kind of quiet ownership transition as the other Illinois bank, a fact Sandra Ogle flagged immediately, notified Ethan that his facility was being terminated effective in 60 days. The stated reason was a portfolio-wide review of credit exposure and private equity. The actual reason, Ethan understood now without needing Briggs to confirm it, was that the bank's new owners had decided to withdraw the facility. The second, a former employee of Caldwell Meridian Holdings, a junior analyst who had left the firm 2 years ago under circumstances that Ethan had managed to keep quiet. He had been caught falsifying due diligence reports on Ethan's instruction, and Ethan had settled with him privately in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement, contacted the firm through an attorney. The NDA, the attorney's letter suggested, contained certain provisions that might warrant review in light of the employee's understanding that its terms may not be enforceable as written. It was a threat with careful legal dressing, and it meant that someone had found this person and put the idea in his head and possibly financed the attorney. The third, Claire Hutchins, the board member who had set her fork down with that precise click at the auberge dinner, resigned from Ethan's board. Her letter cited a change in investment philosophy and was otherwise brief. She had been on his board for 4 years and had, in that time, been difficult to manage but institutionally reliable. Her departure sent a signal to the other two board members that Ethan spent the rest of the week attempting to counteract, with limited success. He called Briggs on a Thursday morning and told him all three things in sequence. The line was quiet for long enough that Ethan said, "Preston, are you there?" "I'm here," Briggs said. His voice had a quality Ethan had not heard in it before, careful in a new way. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without reacting immediately." "Go ahead." "I received a communication yesterday, through professional channels, from an attorney I know peripherally. A very good attorney, as it happens, tax and securities background. The communication was not explicitly a threat. It was framed as an inquiry." Briggs stopped. "They asked about the structure of the financial arrangements in your divorce settlement, specifically about the Delaware LLC and the offshore accounts." Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. "What did you say?" "I said nothing. I am ethically bound by attorney-client privilege, and I made that clear." Another pause. "Ethan, I need you to understand what's happening here. This is not a standard opposing counsel inquiry. The sophistication of the approach, the precision of the questions. They already know the structure. They are not looking for information. They are communicating that they have it." The silence between them had a specific weight. "They're telling me they can move whenever they choose," Ethan said. "That's my reading," Briggs said quietly. Ethan stood at his office window for a long time after he hung up. The city went about its enormous and different business below him. He thought about the night in March when Emily had signed the papers and thanked Briggs and not looked at Ethan. He thought about the phone call 3 weeks ago, her voice perfectly steady, taking care of yourself in that particular tone he still couldn't categorize. She had known, signing those papers. She had known exactly what had been hidden, and she had signed anyway, and she had not said a word to anyone, at least no word he could hear. And she had gone home. And she had done whatever she had done in the months since. And what she had done, as far as he could determine, was simply withdraw the invisible infrastructure that had been propping up his professional life without his knowledge or consent. She hadn't attacked him. She had stopped carrying him. The distinction felt, standing at that window, like the most important distinction he had ever failed to understand, arriving at the worst possible time. October came in cold off the lake, the way Chicago Octobers do. A hard wind that reminded you the city was built on the edge of something vast and indifferent. Ethan's company was bleeding. The credit facility termination had created a cash flow problem that was compounding into a structural problem. 2 deals he had in various stages of development couldn't close without financing that he could no longer source. His remaining board members were asking questions he couldn't satisfactorily answer. Sandra Ogle came to his office on the 14th. And put a cash flow analysis on his desk and sat across from him with the expression of someone who has been accurate all along and finds no pleasure in it. "How long?" he asked, looking at the numbers. "At current burn, 4 months. Maybe 5 if we defer vendor payments aggressively." She paused. "Ethan, we need to talk about whether there is a path that doesn't involve—" "There's a path," he said. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. He had been asking himself that for 3 weeks. He had thought about attorneys, but the attorney situation was complicated by what Briggs knew and by the fact that the opposing party appeared to have access to people considerably more capable than anyone he could rapidly hire. He had thought about going to his network, calling in relationships, generating enough alternative capital to stabilize the operation. He had made 11 calls. 6 had gone unreturned. 3 had produced polite versions of "not right now." 2 had been genuinely sympathetic and ultimately useless. His network, it turned out, was more conditional than he had ever examined it closely enough to see. "I'm working on it," he told Sandra. She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said, and gathered her documents and left, and he could hear in the single word the particular sound of someone who is adjusting their expectations downward. The invitation arrived on the 22nd of October, a physical invitation, heavy cream paper, engraved, delivered to his office by courier. The Whitmore Gala, an annual private event hosted by the Whitmore Foundation, the philanthropic arm of a financial family that had operated quietly in Chicago for several generations. Ethan had heard of it, but had never been invited. The invitations were by personal selection only. He had understood the event as the kind of gathering that happened above his social altitude. The invitation was for November the 3rd. Black tie. Partners welcome. In the lower left corner, in smaller engraved text, a discussion of opportunities in the current investment landscape. He showed it to Briggs, who had come to the office for what was now their weekly attempt to assess the situation. Briggs studied the invitation for a long time. "Do you know who the Whitmore Foundation is connected to?" he asked. "Old Chicago money," Ethan said. "Family trust structure, I think. Private." "It's more than that," Briggs said. "The Whitmore Foundation's endowment management has been handled for the past 15 years by a Wyoming-based investment advisory." He set the invitation down carefully. "I don't need to tell you what I'm thinking." "It's from them," Ethan said. "I believe someone wants to have a conversation," Briggs said. Ethan looked at the invitation. The paper had a quality of certainty to it. Not arrogant, not threatening, just the particular weight of something that knew it did not need to be either of those things. "It says partners welcome," Ethan said. "I noticed." "Vanessa shouldn't come to this." "No," Briggs said. "She shouldn't." Ethan set the invitation on his desk and looked at it for the rest of the afternoon, and he thought about walking into a room to negotiate a rescue deal, which was how he had decided to frame it to himself. A negotiation, something he had always been good at, and he thought about who would be sitting across from him when he got there. He had not spoken to Emily in 6 weeks. He did not know what he would say when he saw her. He spent 11 days between the invitation and the gala trying to construct the version of himself that could walk into that room and manage whatever was waiting for him there. And by the time the 3rd of November arrived, cold and clear, the city sheeted in early winter light, he was as prepared as he had ever been for anything. He would realize, getting out of the car in front of the Whitmore building on North Michigan Avenue, his breath visible in the cold air, his reflection sharpening in the polished brass of the entrance doors, that prepared and ready are not the same thing at all, but that understanding was still a few hours away. For now he straightened his tie, put his hands in his pockets, and walked toward the light. The brass doors of the Whitmore building opened onto a lobby that had been designed to communicate, without any vulgarity of explicitness, that the people who passed through it regularly were not people who needed to be impressed by lobbies. Dark walnut paneling, a single flower arrangement on a round table, white, architectural, nothing showy. A man in a dark suit who said Mr. Caldwell when Ethan walked in, which meant someone had given him a photograph, which meant the evening had been organized to a level of detail that Ethan filed away immediately as information. "This way, please," the man said. The elevator opened directly into a reception space on the 31st floor. Perhaps 60 people, the kind of quiet that comes from everyone in a room being accustomed to money. Waitstaff moved through with champagne and small plates. A string quartet in the far corner played something Ethan didn't recognize. The view through the floor-to-ceiling windows was the city at night, the lake beyond it, black and enormous. He took a champagne glass he didn't intend to drink from and did what he always did in unfamiliar rooms, stood still for 30 seconds and read it. He recognized 2 people from Chicago's financial community, a commercial banking director named Forsyth, whom he'd met twice, and a woman whose face he knew from a real estate conference but whose name he couldn't place. Nobody from his direct professional circle. Nobody who should know he was here or why. The guest list had been assembled for this occasion specifically, he felt, the way you assemble a stage set. He was studying the room when he heard her laugh. He knew it immediately, the way you know certain sounds that have lived in your daily life for years and then gone absent. The specific register of it, low and genuine, not performed. Emily was standing near the windows on the far side of the room with a man in his early 60s whom Ethan didn't recognize, and she was laughing at something the man had said, and she looked. This was the thing that landed on Ethan with unexpected force. She looked like herself, but a version of herself that had been present all along and that he had somehow never quite looked at directly. She was wearing a dark burgundy dress, and her hair was down, and she was holding her champagne glass with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in her surroundings. She had not spotted him yet, or if she had, she was choosing not to show it. Ethan made his way across the room with the studied casualness of someone who has walked into adversarial environments before, and knows that how you enter a room is a statement. He was almost there when a hand landed on his shoulder from behind, a firm, brief grip, the kind that is friendly in form and deliberate in substance. Ethan Caldwell. He turned. William Harper was shorter than Ethan remembered, which was to say he was about 5'11", the same height as Ethan, but something about the economy of how he occupied his physical space made him seem like a man who didn't need additional height. He was 67 years old, and he looked it without apology. Weathered in the specific way of men who have spent real time outdoors, deep lines around his eyes, gray at the temples, a bone structure that had probably been handsome once and was now something more than that. He was wearing a dark suit that fit him well and that he appeared entirely indifferent to. His handshake was the handshake of someone who has shaken a great many hands and stopped thinking about what has communicated 30 years ago. "Bill?" Ethan said, using the name he had always used, the shorter name, the rancher name, and watching William Harper's face for any reaction to it. There was no reaction. "Good to see you," William said, which they both knew was not precisely true, and which he said anyway with the calm of someone for whom social accuracy had always been less important than social function. "Come sit down. I'd like to talk." It was not phrased as a question. Ethan recognized the grammatical structure of a man who had stopped phrasing certain things as questions sometime in his 40s and never gone back. They sat in a pair of chairs near the far windows, angled toward each other, the city spread out behind William's shoulder like a backdrop someone had chosen carefully. Emily had moved to the other side of the room. Ethan could see her in his peripheral vision, but kept his focus on William. "I assume you've been doing some research," William said. "Some," Ethan said. And I have some understanding of your position." Ethan paused. "A partial understanding." William nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he already knew. "What did Roy Esterhaus tell you?" The fact that he knew Roy's name, knew it readily, dropped it into the sentence with no effort, was a demonstration, and both of them understood it as one. Ethan kept his face level. "That you have significant holdings across multiple states," Ethan said. "That some of those holdings intersect with my company's financial relationships." "Intersect," William repeated with something that was not quite a smile. "That's a diplomatic word for it." "What word would you use?" William looked out at the city for a moment. "I'd say I've been paying attention," he said, "for a long time, to a lot of things. To me, specifically." "To my daughter's life," William said, "which included you, for 12 years. The way he said it, included you, past tense, matter of fact, had a quality that was harder to absorb than anything openly hostile would have been. Ethan felt it land and adjusted. "I'd like to understand what you want from this conversation," Ethan said. "I'd rather be direct about it." "I know you would," William said. "That's always been one of your genuine qualities. You'd rather be in a fight you can see than a complicated situation you can't map." He turned back from the window. "What I want is simple. I want you to understand some things you don't currently understand. After that, some decisions will need to be made." "What kind of decisions?" "The kind that are better made with full information," William said. "Are you willing to listen?" Ethan looked at the man across from him. This man he had met 4 times in 12 years and categorized as a minor figure, a background presence, a simple guy from Montana, and understood, sitting in that chair with the city behind them both, that he had not actually seen William Harper once in all that time. He had looked at him and not seen him, which was a different thing entirely. "I'm listening," Ethan said. William talked for 20 minutes without interruption. He talked about the financial structure he had built over 30 years, not boasting, describing it the way a builder describes a building, practically, with attention to engineering. He talked about the specific positions he held that intersected with Ethan's company. He named amounts and entities that Briggs had not been able to find and that Roy Esterhaus had only partially traced. He talked about the timeline of his involvement, how he had maintained a careful distance from Ethan's professional life for 12 years out of respect for Emily's autonomy, because Emily had asked him to, because Emily had believed for a long time that Ethan was worth the effort of loving. "She asked you to stay out of it," Ethan said. "Explicitly," William said, "every time I suggested otherwise." "How many times did you suggest otherwise?" William was quiet for a moment. "More than she knows," he said. "There were things I saw that I didn't tell her, because she'd made her position clear and I respect her more than I respect my own instincts." He paused. "I don't always agree with her, but I trust her judgment about her own life." Ethan sat with that. He thought about Emily at 28, 29, 30, the years when he had been building hardest and paying the least attention to anything that wasn't directly connected to the build. He thought about the things she might have asked her father not to do, the interventions she had forestalled, the patience she had exercised in a direction he had never considered required patience. What changed? He asked. Why now? The divorce settlement, William said simply. What Preston Briggs built. She told you. She walked me through it herself, William said. Every structure, every account, every shell entity. She'd spent 3 weeks mapping it before she called me. He looked at Ethan steadily. She's considerably more capable than you knew. I understand that now. Do you? William's voice didn't change, but something in it sharpened slightly. I'm not sure understanding it now is the same as having seen it when it mattered. That landed clean, and Ethan didn't try to deflect it. No, he said. It isn't. They sat in a brief silence. Across the room, someone was laughing at something, and the string quartet shifted into a different piece, something slower. Ethan watched his champagne glass, which he still hadn't touched. The accounts, Ethan said. The hidden assets. We have a full accounting, William said, including the overseas positions. Including those. And Briggs's role in structuring them. Including that, William said. The attorney who contacted Briggs last month has everything she needs to proceed. The decision to proceed has been, he searched briefly for the word, deferred. Deferred on what condition? That's what the decisions I mentioned are about, William said. He stood up, not hurriedly, with the deliberateness of a man who moves at his own speed in his own time, and said, Emily will join us now. He walked across the room to where Emily was standing, and he touched her arm briefly and said something Ethan couldn't hear, and she looked in Ethan's direction once, and then she walked toward him. She sat in the chair her father had vacated. She was close enough that Ethan could see clearly what he had noticed from across the room. She looked settled in a way that was new. Not happy exactly, not performed contentment. Settled, the way ground that has been disturbed and has had time to stabilize looks different from ground that's currently being moved. Hi, Ethan, she said. Emily. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, which was nothing new. He had spent years not reading Emily's expressions correctly and was apparently continuing the tradition. But there was something different in it now, the looking, like she was seeing him from a greater distance than the physical one between them. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to actually answer it, not manage it. Okay, he said. Did you know, when you had Briggs build those structures, did you know what you were taking, or did you tell yourself some version of it that made it feel like something else? The question sat in the air between them. Ethan looked at his champagne glass for a moment. He thought about the careful, comfortable story he had told himself, that Emily hadn't paid attention to the finances, that the disclosed amount was a reasonable settlement by any objective measure, that Briggs's structures were aggressive but legally defensible. The story had felt solid at the time. Sitting across from Emily in that chair, it felt like exactly what it was, a story, assembled from pieces of true things in a shape that served him. I knew, he said. Something shifted in her face, not anger, something more complicated. Like the difference between suspecting something for a long time and having it confirmed is its own specific experience, separate from the suspicion. Okay, she said quietly. Thank you for that. I'm not sure that deserves thanking. It's the first honest thing you've said to me in probably 3 years, she said. So, yes, thank you. William returned and sat in a third chair that had appeared with the quiet efficiency of a well-run event, and the three of them sat in a rough triangle near the window with the city going on behind them, and William produced a document folder from somewhere and set it on the low table between them and opened it. Here's what exists, he said to Ethan, and here is what we're proposing. The document was 31 pages. Ethan read the relevant sections while William and Emily sat without speaking. The full accounting of the hidden assets. Accurate, exhaustively documented. The Briggs correspondence, annotated. A legal analysis of Ethan's exposure if the material were presented to the relevant authorities, federal tax and securities regulators primarily, along with a civil action for fraudulent concealment in the divorce proceeding. The analysis was precise and genuinely frightening to read, not because it overstated the case, but because it didn't need to. The proposal was on the last 3 pages. Ethan read it twice. Then he set the document down and looked at William. She gets the company, he said. For $1, William confirmed. A clean transfer. All assets, all operational infrastructure, all staff relationships. Caldwell Meridian Holdings becomes Harper Meridian Group under Emily's direction. And the hidden accounts? You disclose and repatriate under a structured timeline that we oversee. The tax liability is yours. There will be penalties. Those are negotiable with the IRS through proper channels, which we will not obstruct. And Briggs? Emily spoke. Preston Briggs made his own choices. What happens to him is between him and his bar association. We're not using him as a weapon. We're not interested in destroying people. Ethan looked at her. Just me. Not destroying you either, she said. If we wanted that, you'd be talking to federal investigators right now instead of sitting here. She paused. This is the alternative to that? Sign over a $112 million company for $1. The company you built using relationships and capital infrastructure that were, in significant part, underwritten by my family's network without your knowledge, William said, with no particular heat in it, which is a thing you should sit with for a moment. Ethan sat with it. It was not comfortable sitting. What William was describing, the bank relationships, the investor introductions, the quiet institutional support that had smoothed the path of Caldwell Meridian Holdings through its crucial early years, had been invisible to Ethan because he had never thought to look for it. He had attributed the ease of certain relationships to his own skill, his own reputation. And his skill was real. His reputation was real. But beneath it, he now understood, there had been a foundation he had never been told about and had never thought to examine because he had been too certain he already understood the shape of what was holding him up. Emily had done that. Or more precisely, Emily had allowed it to continue, the quiet channeling of her family's network toward his benefit, because she had loved him, and because she had believed in what they were building together, and because she was the kind of person who didn't make a production out of the weight she carried. He thought about the night of the auberge dinner, his toast, perfectly adequate partner, the specific calibration of the cruelty in it, public, collegial, designed to land in front of witnesses who mattered to him professionally. He had chosen that wording carefully. He had rehearsed it. He looked at Emily now and found that he could not locate, anywhere inside the reasonable self-justifications he had maintained for 8 months, a version of that toast that held up. I need to ask you something, he said to her. Go ahead. The money, the consulting income you had, the independent work. He stopped. Was any of that connected to your father? Were you working for him? Emily tilted her head slightly. I was doing independent financial consulting. My clients included entities that are connected to my father's network, yes. That's not the same as working for him. She paused. Why? Because I'm trying to understand what I actually knew about your life, Ethan said, which apparently wasn't much. She looked at him with that expression he still couldn't fully read. No, she said. It wasn't. The room went on around them. 60 people, champagne, the quiet string quartet, the enormous city beyond the glass. None of it intrusive. It had the quality of a space that had been arranged to allow a specific kind of conversation to happen, and Ethan had the clear sense that this space, this evening, this entire choreography had been planned with a patience and precision that humbled him purely by comparison. What happens if I don't sign? He asked. William answered. The material goes to the relevant parties Monday morning. The civil action follows. The tax matter becomes considerably less manageable. He was not threatening. He was describing. There is a register in which powerful men state facts, and it sounds different from threats in a way that is worse than threats. And William Harper had been speaking in that register for 30 years. How long do I have to decide? Tonight, William said. The documents are with the Whitmore Foundation's legal counsel downstairs. We can execute before the evening is over if you're ready. Ethan looked at the proposal one more time. 31 pages. $112 million of built company signed to Emily Harper for $1. His hidden accounts disclosed. His company's name changed, his name removed. He thought about Sandra Ogle, who had been accurate all along and found no pleasure in it. He thought about the 11 phone calls he'd made to his network, the 6 that went unreturned. He thought about Vanessa in the kitchen of the River North penthouse, offering to help with a version of the problem she didn't know she didn't understand. He thought about Briggs's face in the gray chair by the window, saying, "I need you to hear this," without reacting immediately. He thought about Emily sitting across from him at that dinner in March, signing her name in her careful handwriting, setting the pen back down, thanking Briggs politely, not looking at him. He had read that moment as her defeat. He understood now that it had been neither defeat nor victory. It had simply been the moment she stopped waiting and started deciding. "I want one thing," he said. "Name it," William said. "I want to talk to Emily. Alone. 10 minutes." William looked at Emily. Emily looked at Ethan for a long moment and then looked at her father and gave him the smallest nod. William stood. "I'll be at the bar," he said, and walked away. And his walk was the walk of a man who has nothing in the world to prove to anyone in any room, and watching it was briefly and unexpectedly painful. They were alone, or as alone as two people can be in a room with 60 others when none of those others are paying attention to them. Emily turned to him and waited. "I need to know," Ethan said. "When did you know? About your father's reach? In my company, in my deals. When did you know it was there?" "About 5 years in," she said. "I noticed some things. Patterns in how certain deals moved. I asked my father directly. He told me." She paused. "I told him to pull back. He pulled back as much as he was willing to, which was not entirely. We argued about it." She looked at her hands for a moment. "I didn't want to be held up by his money, and I didn't want you to be held up by it without knowing. But you didn't tell me." "I tried to," she said. "Twice. You changed the subject both times. I don't think you did it consciously. I think you genuinely didn't hear what I was trying to say." She looked at him directly. "That was part of the problem, Ethan. Not the only part, but part of it." He absorbed that. "And when you signed the papers in March, I'd already talked to my father. I'd already mapped Briggs's structures. I knew what you'd hidden." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't fight it because fighting it in court would have been ugly and long, and I would have needed to expose things that would have exposed my family's involvement in your company, which would have raised questions I didn't want to answer publicly." She straightened slightly in her chair. "And because I wasn't angry enough to want to destroy you, I was just done." "Done," he repeated. "Done," she said. Not unkindly, there's a difference between wanting someone to suffer and simply being finished. She looked out at the city for a moment. "I wasn't done being angry. I was done pretending the marriage was something it had stopped being." She paused. "The dinner at Auberge, what you said. I know. You had people there who respect you, or respected you. You chose to do that in front of them." She looked back at him. "That told me everything I needed to know about where we had arrived." Ethan looked at his hands. "I was trying to make it final," he said. "I think I needed it to feel like a victory in front of witnesses." "I know you were," she said. "That's the saddest part of it." She said it without cruelty, which made it land harder than cruelty would have. "You needed 12 other people in a room to confirm that you'd won something, and what you'd actually done was end the one relationship in your life that was doing more for you than you ever understood." They sat with that for a moment, the city going on around them, both of them in the specific quiet of people who have arrived too late at a truth that would have been useful earlier. "I'll sign," Ethan said. Emily nodded once, no triumph in it, no visible relief either, just the acknowledgement of something that had become, by this point, inevitable. "There's something you should know," she said, "before you sign." He waited. "The company's staff," she said. "Sandra Ogle, the analysts, the support team, 19 people. I intend to keep them all. I'm not signing those people's livelihoods away." She met his eyes. "They didn't do anything wrong." Something happened in Ethan's chest that he didn't have a clean word for. Sandra Ogle, with her printed timelines and her calibrated neutrality and her 4 months of being accurate and finding no pleasure in it. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Emily said. She stood and smoothed her dress and looked down at him for a moment with that expression he'd never been able to read, and he realized sitting there that he'd spent 12 years interpreting Emily's silences as absence, and they had been, every one of them, a different kind of presence. A presence he hadn't had the attention or the humility to recognize. "Should I get my father?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said. She walked across the room toward the bar where William was standing with his back to them, his drink in his hand, looking at the view. She touched his arm and said something, and he turned and looked at Ethan across the room with an expression that was not unkind and not forgiving and not anything Ethan had a simple name for. It was the expression of a man who has watched something unfold over a very long time and is witnessing its conclusion with something closer to exhaustion than satisfaction. They walked back together, father and daughter, and Emily sat and William stood, and a man in a dark suit materialized from somewhere with the document folder, and the city went on beyond the glass in all its enormous permanence, and Ethan picked up the pen that was offered to him. His hand was steady. He was not sure why. He signed his name on 11 pages, his usual signature, the signature he'd developed in his late 20s when he'd decided what he wanted his professional identity to look like, angled and deliberate. And he set the pen down and did not feel what he had expected to feel, which was the particular collapse of a man who has lost everything. What he felt instead was something harder to categorize, like a specific kind of tired that goes all the way down. Like a man at the end of a very long argument that he has just understood, for the first time, he was never going to win. The man in the dark suit gathered the pages and left. William took the folder from him and handed it to Emily, who held it without looking at it. "There will be a tax meeting scheduled through Briggs's replacement," William said. "You'll receive the timeline through counsel." "I understand," Ethan said. William extended his hand. Ethan shook it. William's grip was what it had been at the beginning of the evening. The grip of a man who had stopped thinking about what his handshake communicated 30 years ago, because he no longer needed it to communicate anything. "Take care of yourself," William said, and walked away, and that was that. Emily looked at Ethan for a moment, the folder in her hands, the city behind her. "What will you do?" she asked. It was a genuine question, he thought, not a taunt. "I don't know yet," he said, which was the most honest answer he'd given in possibly years. She nodded, as if this was acceptable, and maybe it was. Maybe honesty, even belated honesty about not knowing, was acceptable when nothing else was available. "Good night, Ethan," she said. She walked away, and he watched her move through the room. The way she stopped to say something to a woman near the door, something that made the woman smile. And then she was gone, through the door and into whatever her life was now. And the room went on around him with its 60 people and its champagne and its string quartet, and Ethan sat alone in his chair by the window with an empty glass and the specific weight of a night that had taken everything he had built and rearranged it into a shape he did not yet understand. Outside, the city lay against the darkness of the lake, patient and enormous, going about its permanent business. He sat and looked at it for a long time before he finally stood up and put on his coat and took the elevator down to the cold November street, where a wind came off the water with a force that felt almost personal, and he walked to his car alone and drove back through the lit city toward a penthouse that was, he understood now with a clarity that felt like its own kind of damage, not going to feel like home tonight. It didn't feel like home the next morning either, or the morning after that. Vanessa noticed the change before he told her anything. She was good at reading environments. It was her professional skill applied constantly to her personal life. And she read the penthouse the way she read a client situation in crisis, with the calm efficiency of someone assessing damage before deciding whether to manage it or walk away from it. "You signed something at that dinner," she said on the second morning, standing in the kitchen in her work clothes, coffee in hand, watching him the way she watched things when she was deciding whether to press. "Yes," he said. "What did you sign?" He told her the short version. Not everything. Not Briggs's structures, not the hidden accounts, not the full picture of what William Harper controlled. The version he told her was this. He had been in a significantly worse legal and financial position than he had represented to her, and he had made a settlement to avoid litigation, and the settlement had included the company. She was quiet for a long time after he finished, long enough that he could hear traffic from 40 floors below, the particular sound of the city going about its indifferent mourning. "The company," she said. "Yes. Caldwell Meridian. It won't be called that anymore." She set her coffee down on the counter with a care that was more controlled than it appeared. "You lost your company, Ethan." "I transferred it." "That's a gentler word for the same thing." She looked at him directly. "Who did you transfer it to?" He waited a beat too long. "Emily," Vanessa said. "It's complicated." "I'm sure it is." Her voice had gone to a register he hadn't heard from her before. Not angry, not wounded, something more evaluative than either of those. The voice of a professional calculating the distance between the situation as described and the situation as it actually was. How long have you known that you were in this position? A few months, he said. Months, she repeated. And you were going to tell me I was managing it. You were managing it. She picked her coffee back up and looked out the window at the city. You brought me into a life I thought was one thing, Ethan. The penthouse, the plans we talked about, the investment discussions you said were coming together. She turned back to him. Were any of that real? The plans were real, he said. The situation changed. The situation changed because Emily's father has more money than you knew, and he used it to dismantle your operation, and you signed the company away rather than face... She stopped. Rather than face what exactly? What were you avoiding? He looked at her. He thought about all the things he could not tell her without explaining Briggs and the Delaware LLC and the offshore accounts and the 6-year architecture of a financial arrangement that had seemed, at the time of its construction, like intelligent asset management and which looked, in the morning light of a November kitchen, like exactly what it was. I made some choices in the divorce settlement that created legal exposure, he said. The transfer was the way to resolve it without that exposure becoming a prosecution. The word prosecution landed in the room and stayed there. Vanessa looked at him for a long time. She was 36, and she had built a career on managing situations that other people had allowed to get beyond their control, and she had a clear eye for the difference between a situation that was genuinely recoverable and one where the damage was structural. He watched her do that calculation. He watched the calculation conclude. I think, she said carefully, that I need some time to understand what I'm actually looking at here. Vanessa, I'm not leaving, she said, which was precisely what someone says when they are considering leaving and haven't decided yet. I'm saying I need to think. I need to understand what the actual situation is before I can figure out what it means for us. She picked up her bag from the counter. I have a client meeting at 9. We can talk tonight. She left. The door closed behind her with the same quality of finality that Briggs's door had carried in his old office. The click of a well-fitted mechanism performing its designed function. Ethan stood in the kitchen and drank his coffee and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives after you have had one night and 2 mornings to sit with the shape of what you've lost, that the conversation Vanessa had promised for tonight was not going to go the way he wanted it to. He was right. She came home at 7 with the careful manner of someone who has spent the day deciding something and has reached a conclusion they know will be unwelcome and are delivering it anyway because they have enough self-respect to be direct. She said she needed someone who was moving forward, not someone climbing out of a hole that she hadn't known existed. She said she cared about him, which was probably true in the limited way that people care about a version of someone that turns out not to have been the whole person. She said she hoped he would land somewhere good. She was out of the penthouse within 2 weeks, efficiently, without drama, taking the things she'd accumulated in the months they'd lived there. The space felt, without her, like a stage set after the show is closed. All the architecture of a life still present, the meaning that had animated it gone. Ethan sat in it for 3 days, and then called the leasing agent and began the process of breaking the lease. December came in hard off the lake. Ethan moved into a short-term furnished apartment in Lincoln Square. 2 bedrooms, a view of a parking structure, a kitchen with appliances that all worked, and none of which were things he would have chosen, and began the process of understanding what remained. What remained was not nothing, which surprised him slightly, though it probably shouldn't have. The hidden accounts, now in the process of disclosure and repatriation under the timeline William had described, represented real money even after the tax liabilities and penalties were settled. He would not be destitute. He would be significantly diminished, which was its own category of difficulty for a man who had organized his identity around expansion. He called Briggs in December. Briggs's number rang to voicemail, and the voicemail message had changed to a generic automated one, which meant Briggs had either changed his number or discontinued the service. He called the office number for Briggs's practice, and a woman he didn't recognize told him that Preston Briggs was no longer with the firm. She did not elaborate. He did not press. He had coffee with Sandra Ogle on a Thursday, in the second week of December, at a place in Lincoln Park she had suggested. She arrived exactly on time in her gray coat, ordered tea, and looked at him with the expression he had come to associate with her. the expression of someone who has already processed what other people are still arriving at. "How is the transition going?" he asked. "Ms. Harper is thorough," Sandra said. "She asks good questions. She spent 2 weeks meeting with each member of staff individually. She wrapped both hands around her tea mug. She already understood most of the operational architecture. I'm not sure where she learned it. She didn't ask me to explain things I expected to have to explain." Ethan nodded. He thought about Emily at the kitchen table with her legal pad and her laptop, columns of numbers she had tilted away from him. "Is she going to keep you?" he asked. "She's already confirmed it," Sandra said. "She confirmed it in the first meeting." She looked at him evenly. She confirmed all 19 staff members in the first week. She made a point of doing it before any other business. Ethan looked at his coffee cup. "That sounds like her," he said. Sandra studied him for a moment. "Can I ask you something? You don't have to answer." "Go ahead." "Did you know what she was capable of when you were married?" He thought about the honest answer to that, the way he had been trying to think about honest answers since November 3rd. "I knew she was smart," he said. "I didn't know the shape of it. I was paying attention to other things." Sandra nodded slowly, the nod of a woman who has suspected the answer and is now confirming it. "She paid your company $1, she said. For what it's worth, she told me it was not about humiliating you. She said—" Sandra paused, choosing her words. "She said she paid $1 because it was the accurate price, given what she was actually acquiring and what it had cost her." Ethan sat with that for a moment. The accurate price. A company he had spent years building, paid for in 12 years of quiet, invisible labor that he had never thought to cost out. "She's right," he said. Sandra looked at him with something that was not quite sympathy, and not quite its absence either. "What will you do now?" "I'm working on that," he said. It was still the most honest answer he had. He spent January thinking. He was not good at pure thinking, unattached to action, sitting inside a situation without immediately moving to manage or resolve it. He was constitutionally impatient with stillness, and the furnished apartment in Lincoln Square, with its view of the parking structure, was a punishing environment for a man who had organized his life around forward motion. He went for long walks along the lakefront in the January cold, the water gray and violent, the wind the kind that makes the city feel like a serious place. He ate at unremarkable restaurants by himself and read and thought, and occasionally caught himself beginning to make lists of professional contacts to call, potential structures for a new operation, paths back toward the version of himself he understood, and then stopped and tried to sit with the discomfort of not immediately strategizing. He was not good at it, but he was practicing. He thought about auberge. He thought about the toast he had rehearsed. He had been so certain, standing there with his champagne glass, that he was reading the room correctly, that he was in control of the narrative, that the witnesses he had assembled would confirm for him what he needed confirmed. He had misread every element of that evening. Emily's composure had not been resignation. His friend's laughter had not been solidarity. Claire Hutchins' set-down fork had been a judgment, not a discomfort. The entire room had seen something he had been too performed to see himself. He thought about what Roy Esterhuis had said. "They have been paying attention to you for longer than you've been paying attention to them." He had applied that to William Harper, to the strategic intelligence of what had been assembled against him. But sitting in January cold, walking the gray lakeshore, he began to understand that it applied in a different direction too. Emily had been paying attention to him, to the actual him, not the curated version, for 12 years. She had seen the impatience and the vanity and the specific quality of his ambition that required other people to be smaller so that he could feel larger. She had seen all of it, and she had stayed anyway, and she had tried twice to tell him things he had not been able to hear, and she had kept carrying the invisible weight of their life until the weight of the divorce settlement had become a different kind of thing than she could carry. He was not, he thought, a villain of the straightforward kind. He was something more common, and in some ways harder to reckon with. A man who had been intelligent in the ways that rewarded him and blind in the ways that didn't cost him immediately, until they did. He called Emily in late January. He was not sure why, or rather he was sure, but the reasons felt inadequate to say aloud. He called and she answered, and he said, "I'm not calling about anything specific. I wanted to say that I'm sorry for the dinner, for the toast, for—" He stopped. "For a lot of things, but specifically for that." The line was quiet for a moment. Okay, Emily said. That's all I wanted to say. I heard you, she said. And then after a pause that he didn't try to fill, I appreciate it, Ethan. I do. How's the company? Good, she said. We're changing the focus somewhat. More community-oriented lending. There's a market there that's been underserved. He almost said something about that. Some professional reflex about returns, about whether that positioned the firm correctly for growth, and he stopped himself. That sounds like you, he said instead. Yeah, she said. It is. They were quiet for a moment, the comfortable quiet of two people who have nothing left to perform for each other. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, Ethan. He hung up and sat with the phone in his hand in his Lincoln Square apartment, the parking structure gray and particular outside the window, and he thought that whatever came next for him, it would have to be built on different ground than what he'd used before. He didn't know yet what that looked like. He was still working on having the patience to find out. In Montana, he suspected, a man in a 12-year-old truck was driving home along a valley road in the winter dark, the Clark Fork somewhere out there beyond the headlights, unhurried. And in a building in the Loop, the lights of Harper Meridian Group were probably on late, because Emily was the kind of person who worked late when the work mattered to her. He had known that about her, he realized. He had just never asked what the work was. The Ohio company was called Vantage Distribution, regional food logistics, 43 employees, a warehouse in Columbus, and a smaller facility in Dayton that had been bleeding money for 3 years. Ethan flew in on a Monday morning in late July and drove a rental car from the airport through flat Ohio summer and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a small achievement for a man who had spent most of his adult life thinking about something every waking minute. The operations manager was a 60-year-old man named Gerald Soto, who had been with the company for 22 years and who greeted Ethan in the parking lot with the wariness of someone who has watched outside consultants arrive and depart without improving anything. Gerald was broad-shouldered and deliberate, and had the quality of a man who understood every physical system in the building he managed and trusted none of the financial ones. You're the turnaround guy, Gerald said. Not unfriendly, just accurate. I'm trying to understand the situation before I call it anything, Ethan said. Gerald looked at him for a moment. You want the tour first or the numbers? The tour, Ethan said. Something shifted slightly in Gerald's expression. Good answer, he said, and led him inside. Ethan spent 2 days in Columbus and 1 in Dayton, and he walked every part of both operations and asked questions and listened to the answers without redirecting. And by the end of the 3rd day, he understood something that the financial documents had not told him. The company's operations were genuinely excellent. Gerald Soto ran a tight, well-trained warehouse floor with almost no waste and a customer satisfaction record that was, in the regional food distribution industry, remarkable. The problem was not the operations. The problem was that the previous ownership had taken on debt to finance an acquisition 5 years ago that had never integrated correctly, and the debt service was consuming margin that the operations were actually generating. He called Diane from his Columbus hotel room on Wednesday evening. It's a real business, he said. The operations are good. Gerald Soto is one of the best operations managers I've encountered. The problem is purely structural, the acquisition debt. Can we restructure it? We can do better than restructure it, Ethan said. The Dayton facility was the acquisition. It's never performed because the customer base doesn't overlap with Columbus the way the original analysis assumed. If we sell Dayton separately, there's a regional operator who'd buy it. We eliminate 60% of the debt service and free up working capital that Gerald can actually use. And the 43 employees? 31 in Columbus, 12 in Dayton. The Dayton buyer would need to retain the Dayton staff as a condition of sale. I'd make that non-negotiable. Diane was quiet for a moment. You're proposing to make staff retention a deal condition. Yes. That reduces our leverage in the Dayton negotiation. It also means we're not the people who destroyed 12 families' livelihoods to improve a balance sheet, Ethan said, and it's the right thing to do. Another pause. I need to think about the leverage question. I know, he said. Think about it. But I'm not going to recommend a structure that involves letting those 12 people go. She called back the next morning. Staff retention as a condition, she said. Make it work. He made it work. It took 6 weeks and 4 trips to Columbus and 2 trips to Dayton and 1 very difficult conversation with the Dayton buyer's attorney who pushed back hard on the retention condition, and whom Ethan held firm against with the specific stubbornness of a man who has decided which things are not negotiable and means it. The deal closed in September. The Dayton staff transferred with their seniority and benefits intact. Gerald Soto called Ethan the day the paperwork finalized and said, in the voice of a man who doesn't say things he doesn't mean, "You did right by this company." Ethan sat in his car in the Columbus parking lot after the call and looked at the flat Ohio sky and thought that he had not heard those words directed at him in a professional context in longer than he could accurately remember, and that they landed differently than he had expected, not as validation, not as the confirmation of an image, just as a true thing said plainly by a person who had seen the situation clearly. He drove to the airport and flew home. Fall settled over Chicago with its usual authority. The lake went gray and serious. The trees on his Andersonville street gave up their leaves in the gradual way of things that have held on as long as they reasonably can. Ethan settled into the rhythm of the new work, a pace that was demanding without being frantic, purposeful without the particular anxious forward drive that had characterized his previous professional life. He took 2 more deals through assessment in the fall. One he recommended they pursue. One he recommended against, for reasons that took 30 pages to explain and that Diane Marsh accepted without argument because the prior 2 assessments had established a track record she trusted. He saw Emily at the 3rd quarterly advisory board meeting in October. She presented the first cohort's full-year performance data, which was better than the projections had modeled. 8 of 11 borrowers current on payments, 2 on modified schedules that were performing, 1 who had closed the business but had repaid the principal. The bakery run by the man with the embezzlement conviction had opened in January as planned and had, by October, a waiting list for weekend reservations. Emily presented this last detail without emphasis, which was precisely the right amount of emphasis. The cohort's performance is going to change the conversation with potential institutional partners, she said. We have a meeting with a regional bank foundation in November. They're interested in co-lending on cohort 3. How much? Ethan asked. They're talking about matching our capital commitment, she said, which would double the cohort size. What are their conditions? That's what the November meeting is about. She looked at him across the table. I'd like you in that meeting, not as an advisor. As someone who can speak to the risk framework credibly to a banking Claude's response was interrupted. The November meeting with the Regional Bank Foundation went for 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than scheduled because the Foundation's investment committee had more questions than anticipated, and Emily had decided, somewhere around the 90-minute mark, to answer all of them rather than defer to a follow-up. Ethan sat at the table and presented the risk framework when called on and answered the technical questions that came his way, and watched Emily work the room with the particular quality he had been observing for 2 years now. The quality of someone who had nothing to prove and therefore didn't spend energy proving it, who answered hard questions directly without dressing them up, who said, I don't know yet, but here's how we'll find out, twice in the meeting and lost no credibility for it, who seemed to grow more settled rather than more pressured as the questions got harder. The Foundation's lead investment officer was a careful man named Arthur Bellingham, who had spent 30 years in community development finance and who asked questions the way people ask questions when they have seen many iterations of a good idea fail in execution, with the specific skepticism of experience rather than the general skepticism of caution. He looked at the cohort performance data for a long time before he spoke. The default rate is better than our own comparable portfolio, he said. That's not what I expected. The support infrastructure is the variable, Emily said. Capital alone doesn't produce these outcomes. The partnership with Dr. Okonkwo's organization gives borrowers access to ongoing business coaching. When something goes wrong, and things go wrong, there's someone to call who can help them problem solve before a late payment becomes a default. That increases your cost per loan. It decreases your loss rate, Emily said. The math works out. Bellingham looked at the numbers again. The embezzlement conviction borrower, he said. The bakery. Yes. That would not have passed our standard credit committee. No, Emily said. It wouldn't have passed ours either, under conventional criteria. We used different criteria. And it performed. It performed, Emily said. He's opening a second location in March. Bellingham set the report down with the deliberate quality of a man making a decision. We'd like to co-lend on Cohort 3, he said. I'll need to take the formal proposal to our board, but I'm recommending approval. He looked at Emily directly. I want to understand something before we proceed. This program is embedded in a private investment firm. What happens to the program if the firm's direction changes? Emily held his gaze. The program is structured as a separate subsidiary with its own endowment commitment and its own board, she said. It doesn't depend on the firm's deal flow for capital. We set it up that way intentionally. Whose idea was that? Mine, Emily said. With input from our advisory board. Bellingham nodded slowly. Smart, he said. I've seen too many programs like this fold when the parent organization's priorities shift. So have I, Emily said. That's why we built it the way we did. After the meeting, walking to the elevator with the foundation representatives, Ethan fell into step beside Bellingham, and Bellingham said without preamble, "The risk framework is the most rigorous thing I've seen applied to this population. Who built it?" Collaborative process, Ethan said. Emily directed it. Kevin Park built the modeling. I contributed to the structural architecture. Dr. Okonkwo contributed the population-specific variables. Bellingham looked at him sideways. That's a diplomatic answer. It's also accurate, Ethan said. Bellingham smiled, briefly, the smile of a man who is sparing with them. Good answer, he said, which was what Gerald Soto had said in the Columbus parking lot, and Ethan thought there was something in that, in the same words from very different people that told him something true about where he had arrived. The Bank Foundation's board approved the co-lending arrangement in December. Emily called him the afternoon the approval came through, and he could hear in her voice the specific sound of genuine relief, not triumphant, not performed, just the exhale of someone who has been carrying the weight of an uncertain outcome and has set it down. Cohort 3 launches in February, she said. 34 borrowers, combined capital commitment of $800,000. That's more than double Cohort 2, he said. I know. A pause. It's the right size. We can support it operationally. I've already talked to Dr. Okonkwo about expanding the support team. You're sure about February? That's a tight timeline for due diligence on 34 applications. Kevin has been running rolling due diligence since September, she said. We anticipated the foundation approval. We'll be ready. He thought about that. The months of preparation for an outcome that wasn't certain. The work done in advance of confirmation because waiting for confirmation would have lost the time. It was the kind of operational patience he had never practiced in his previous professional life. He had always preferred to move when things were certain, which meant he had always been slightly behind where the work actually needed to happen. That's well run, he said. Sandra taught me that too, Emily said. Do the work before you need it. They talked for a few more minutes about the Cohort 3 criteria, a refinement Kevin had proposed that Emily wanted Ethan's read on, and then wrapped up in the efficient way of two people who have learned each other's professional rhythms well enough to know when a conversation has produced what it needed to produce. He sat with his phone after she hung up and thought about 3 years. 3 years since the dinner at Auberge, since the champagne glass raised in that private dining room, since the words perfectly adequate partner had gone out into the air in front of witnesses. 3 years of consequence and reconstruction and the slow, unglamorous work of becoming someone who could sit at the corner of a table and do good work without needing to be its center. 3 years since Emily Harper had signed her name in careful handwriting and set the pen down and thanked Preston Briggs politely and not looked at Ethan on her way out the door. He pulled the yellow legal pad from the nightstand, the third one now, the first two filled and kept in the desk drawer, and wrote for 20 minutes. Not about the bank approval, not about Emily's call, about what the past 3 years had actually been. The honest accounting, the version without the defensive framing, the version he would give if someone who knew everything asked him to describe what had happened and why. He wrote, I spent 44 years believing that clarity was something I had and other people lacked. I organized my entire life around that belief. What I learned, at significant cost to myself and at greater cost to the people around me, is that I was confusing certainty with clarity. Certainty is a feeling. Clarity is what you see when you stop protecting the feeling. He looked at that for a moment and then kept writing because the thought wasn't finished. Emily saw clearly. She saw me clearly, which I found threatening in ways I didn't understand as threat at the time. I translated her accuracy into inadequacy because the alternative, that she was seeing something real that I was refusing to see, was not something I was built to absorb. I am still not sure I am fully built for it, but I am trying to be, which is different from where I started. He closed the pad and put it back in the nightstand and went to sleep. Christmas that year, he drove to Wisconsin. Tom Garrett's family had a house on a lake in the northern part of the state where they spent the holidays, and Tom had invited him 3 years running, and the first 2 years he had declined for reasons that were mostly about image. A man alone at someone else's family Christmas felt like a public admission of something he wasn't ready to admit publicly. This year he said yes without deliberating about it, which was itself a measure of something. The house was old and drafty, and full of the specific comfortable chaos of a family that has been coming to the same place for a long time. Tom's wife, a pediatrician named Ruth, who had a gift for making people feel neither observed nor ignored, handed Ethan a glass of wine when he arrived and introduced him to the 2 other families who were there, and then left him to find his own level in the room, which was exactly the right move. He found his level easily. He played a card game with Tom's teenagers and lost badly and without embarrassment. He helped Ruth in the kitchen on Christmas morning, chopping vegetables and following instructions with the focus of someone learning a new set of rules, and Ruth talked to him about her work, the particular challenges of pediatrics in underserved communities, the bureaucratic obstacles that made good care harder than it needed to be. And he asked questions and listened to the full answers, and at one point said something about the structural parallel to what Harper Meridian's lending program was trying to address. And Ruth looked at him with the surprise of someone who had not expected the conversation to go there, and was glad it had. "Tom told me about what you've been working on," Ruth said. "The program for people coming out of prison. I'm on the advisory board," Ethan said. "Emily runs it." "He said you built the risk framework." "Collaboratively," he said, which was accurate, and had stopped feeling like false modesty, and had started feeling like just the true description of how it had happened. Ruth looked at him for a moment with the appraising quality of a doctor who has learned to take quick and accurate readings of people. "You seem different than how Tom described you from before," she said. "How did Tom describe me?" "Someone who took up all the oxygen in a room," she said without apology. "He said you'd changed. I wasn't sure I believed him." She turned back to the vegetables. "I believe him now." He drove home from Wisconsin on the 26th through a light snow and thought about oxygen, about how much of it he had consumed in every room he had ever been in without noticing that other people needed it too. About Emily in their kitchen tilting the laptop screen, about Sandra across the desk with her printed timelines, about the 2 board members at Auberge who had laughed nervously and the one who had set her fork down with that precise click, about Gerald Soto in the Columbus parking lot, about Kevin Park typing a thing worth remembering into his phone, about all the rooms that had been slightly short of air while he was in them, and the people who had found ways to breathe anyway. The snow came down light and steady, and the highway was mostly empty, and the radio played something he didn't recognize, and he drove through the dark in the ordinary way of a man going home, and it was enough. In February, Vanessa Reed was released from federal custody after serving 14 months of her 18-month sentence. Ethan found out through Tom, who had seen a brief notice. He sat with the information for a day and then let it go because there was nothing useful he could do with it, and because holding it accomplished nothing except to keep him oriented toward a past that had been concluded. He did not contact her. He did not expect her to contact him. Whatever she was going to build from where she had arrived was her construction to make, and whether she made it or didn't was not something he could influence or should try to. He thought about what Emily had said in the penthouse kitchen 3 years ago, in the conversation that had ended with her leaving. "I need someone who is moving forward, not someone climbing out of a hole." He had understood that at the time as abandonment. He understood it now as accuracy. Vanessa had seen, correctly, that the hole was real and deep, and she had made her choice. The choice she had made afterward was a different matter. People make the choices they make from wherever they're standing at the time. The work was to change where you were standing. Cohort 3 launched in February as planned. 34 borrowers, $800,000 in combined capital. Emily sent the advisory board a brief update email on launch day. Factual, no fanfare, 3 paragraphs. And at the bottom, in a postscript that was the most Emily thing she had ever written to him, she added, "The bakery is catering the launch event," he insisted. Ethan read that postscript 3 times and then wrote back 2 words. Good call. She replied, his croissants are better than auberges. He stared at that for a moment. It was the first time either of them had referenced auberge directly in 3 years, not as a wound, as a data point, delivered with the dry precision of someone who has fully metabolized a thing and can now simply note it. He wrote back, that's a low bar. And then, because it was true, and because he had been practicing saying true things, but I believe it. She sent a single character back, a period, which meant, yes, and we're done with that. He set his phone down and went to work. Spring came, and with it the particular Chicago quality of relief. The lake going blue again, the streets returning to human temperature, the city remembering that it is capable of warmth. Ethan walked the lakefront on a Saturday morning in April and thought about what the past 3 years had produced. Not in a summary way, not in the way you assemble a narrative for someone else's consumption, but in the honest inventory way he had been practicing. What was real? What remained? What remained was this: a job that used his actual capabilities for purposes he could stand behind. A small number of relationships, Tom and Ruth, Kevin Park, Diane Marsh, Dr. Okonkwo, whom he had come to know through the advisory board work, that were based on who he actually was rather than the position he occupied. A legal situation that had been resolved at significant cost and was no longer an active threat. A yellow legal pad, now nearly full, that contained the most honest accounting of himself he had ever produced, and a working relationship with his former wife that was functional and respectful and occasionally, in the right moments, something warmer than that, though neither of them named it as such. What was not remaining? The penthouse, the car, the performance of a rival, the network that had been conditional on his position, the version of himself that had needed witnesses for every victory and had rehearsed his own toasts. Preston Briggs. The confidence that certainty was the same as understanding. He walked for 2 hours along the lake and let the April wind do what April wind does in Chicago. Remind you that the city is at the edge of something vast and doesn't particularly care about your plans. And he thought about a question he had been sitting with for a while. Not what do I want in the way he had always asked it, which was really asking what do I want to have or what do I want to be seen having? But the other version, the harder one. What do I want to be true about the way I move through the world? He had arrived at some answers. They were incomplete and probably always would be, because that was the nature of answers to that question. They didn't conclude, they just got more honest over time if you kept asking. But he had some. He wanted to be the kind of person who saw other people clearly and treated what he saw with care. He wanted to do work that was real and that left things better than he found them. He wanted to be in rooms without consuming all the oxygen. He wanted to say true things even when true things cost him something. He was not always those things. He backslid. There were meetings where the old impatience surfaced, and he had to consciously hold it back, and sometimes he didn't hold it back completely and had to repair something afterward. There were moments when the ghost of the old mode appeared and offered him the old comfortable certainties, and he was not always strong enough to decline. He was a work in progress in the way that people are works in progress, imperfectly, with backsliding, without the clean narrative arc that makes a satisfying story, but that has almost no relationship to how actual change happens in actual people. What he had was the practice, the daily return to the honest inventory, the willingness to be corrected, the slowly accumulating evidence from Gerald Soto and Kevin Park and Ruth Garrett and Arthur Bellingham that a different kind of competence was available to him if he could stay honest enough to access it. That would have to be enough. Most days, it was. Patasim. In May, William Harper came to Chicago. He was not there specifically to see Ethan. He was there for a board meeting of one of his Illinois-connected entities, the kind of thing that appeared on no public calendar and generated no press. But he called Ethan on a Tuesday and said he had a morning free on Thursday and asked if Ethan wanted to have breakfast. They met at a diner in Lincoln Square, which William had apparently researched and chosen specifically because it was the kind of place he preferred. Booths, coffee in heavy mugs, a menu that did not attempt to be interesting. He arrived already seated when Ethan got there, reading something on his phone with the complete attention of a man who does one thing at a time, and he put the phone away when Ethan sat down and gave him the handshake that was the same as it had always been. They ordered. The coffee came. They talked for a while about the Ohio turnaround deal. William had heard about it, which Ethan might have found unnerving 2 years ago and now found simply characteristic. And William asked two questions that were better than most questions Ethan had fielded from people directly involved in the deal. He answered them honestly. Then William said, without transition, "How are you actually doing?" "Better," Ethan said. "Actually better, not managed answer better." William looked at him with those steady eyes that had always seen more than they revealed. "I know," he said. "I can see it." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "I want to say something, and I want you to just hear it. Not respond to it. Just hear it." "Okay," Ethan said. "Emily is happy," William said. "Not in a circumstantial way. Not because things are going well with the program or the firm, though they are. Happy in herself. She's found who she is when she's not organized around someone else's needs." He paused. "That's what I wanted for her for a long time. Longer than she knows. And it took everything that happened to get her there." He looked at Ethan steadily. "I'm not thanking you for what you did. The divorce, the hidden assets, the settlement, that was wrong, and I think you know that now more clearly than I could tell you. But the way you've handled what came after, that gave Emily room to build without fighting you, and that mattered." Ethan held the instruction to not respond. It was one of the harder things he'd been asked to do in recent memory. William picked up his coffee. "That's all," he said. "Now tell me about the second deal you're assessing. Tom mentioned something about a plastics manufacturer in Michigan." They talked for another hour. The food came, and they ate it, and the diner went about its morning business around them. And William asked questions and listened to full answers and occasionally offered a perspective that was brief and precise and worth more than it took up space. And Ethan thought about what it would have been like to have known this man. Actually known him. Not the rancher-shaped absence he had constructed. For the 12 years he had been adjacent to him. He would never know the answer to that. That was one of the costs, paid and irreversible. When they were putting on their coats to leave, William said, "You should know that Emily thinks highly of the work you're doing with the program. She doesn't say it often, because that's not how she's built, but she's said it to me twice, which in Emily's accounting is a great deal." "I know how she's built," Ethan said. William looked at him with something that was not quite a smile. "Yes," he said. "You do. Now." He buttoned his coat. "That's not nothing." They parted on the sidewalk outside the diner, the May morning going about its business around them, the trees on the street in full leaf. William shook his hand, firm, brief, the same as always, and turned and walked toward wherever he was going, unhurried and entirely himself, a man who had built something enormous and invisible and had found no reason to make sure anyone knew it. And watching him go, Ethan thought about the different ways power can express itself and which of them endure. The summer passed. The advisory board met in July. Cohort 3's 3-month data was strong. 31 of 34 borrowers current, 2 on adjusted schedules performing, 1 who had contacted the support team proactively about a cash flow problem and worked through it before it became a default. The man with the embezzlement conviction had opened his second location in March, as planned, and was already discussing a third with Kevin, who had become the program's primary relationship manager for ongoing borrower contact. At the July meeting, Emily announced that a national foundation had approached Harper Meridian about potentially replicating the program's model in 3 other cities. She presented it straightforwardly to us. The opportunity, the resource requirements, the timeline, the risks. She looked around the table at the board members and said, "I want honest assessments, not enthusiasm. This is a significant operational expansion, and we should only do it if we can do it well." Dr. Okonkwo said the support infrastructure model was replicable, but would require genuine local partnership, not a franchise approach. James Reardon said the legal landscape varied enough by state that they'd need local counsel in each city before launching. Kevin said the data management requirements would need a dedicated hire. Ethan said the risk framework was portable, but would need calibration to local market conditions, and that he'd want to run a parallel assessment in each city before full launch. Emily took notes on all of it. She asked follow-up questions. She did not signal which direction she was leaning. At the end of the meeting, she said, "I'm going to spend the next 60 days doing a serious feasibility assessment before we give the foundation an answer. I'd like each of you to contribute a written perspective on the biggest single risk you see in expansion. 1 page, direct. Don't soften it." She looked around the table. "The program works because we've been honest about what it can and can't do. I don't want to expand in a way that compromises what's working here. She closed her notebook. Thank you all. This was useful. Walking out of the conference room, Ethan fell into step beside her for the first time in a while. Usually they moved in different directions at the end of meetings, back to their respective calendars. She was looking at her phone at the notifications that had accumulated during the 2-hour meeting, processing them with the speed of someone who has learned to triage quickly. The national expansion, he said. What do you actually think? She glanced up from her phone. What do you think I think? I think you want to do it, and you're making yourself slow down, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. That's right. Good instinct, he said. Both the wanting and the slowing down. She almost smiled. Kevin drafted a preliminary framework last month, she said, without being asked. He was up at midnight 3 nights in a row working on it. She paused. He's going to run it if we do it. He just doesn't know that yet. He's ready, Ethan said. I know, she said. They had reached the elevator. She pressed the button and they stood waiting in the particular way of 2 people who have found the comfortable distance of colleagues, close enough for honest conversation, far enough for each person to be fully themselves. Thank you, she said, without looking at him, still at her phone. For what specifically? For today. For the past year and a half. She looked up. For taking the corner seat and staying in it. He thought about all the things that were in that sentence. The Whitmore Gala, the corner of the table, the advisory board meetings, the phone calls about risk frameworks and lending criteria and cohort performance data. The fact that he had shown up and done the work and not tried to make it about anything other than what it was. It's good work, he said. That makes it easy. No, it doesn't, she said. Not for someone like you. It takes something, and you've given it consistently. She looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him that first night at the Whitmore when he had finally been still enough to actually be looked at. I want you to know I see that. The elevator arrived. She stepped in and turned around, and the doors stayed open for a moment in the way elevator doors do, and she was standing in the frame of them with her notebook and her phone and the particular settled quality she had carried for the past 2 years. The quality of someone who has found the shape of her own life and is inhabiting it fully. The expansion feasibility, she said. I want your written assessment by September 1st. You'll have it, he said. The doors closed. He stood at the elevator for a moment and then turned and walked back through the building, through the office that had once been his and was now something better than what it had been, and took the stairs down because he felt like walking, and pushed through the lobby door into the July afternoon, the city going about its enormous permanent business, the lake visible between the buildings if you looked at the right angle, blue and vast and entirely indifferent to the particular lives being lived at its edge. This is the thing about people like Emily Harper that the world consistently fails to understand until it's too late to matter. They are not waiting for anyone to notice them. They do not require the room to reconfigure itself around them. They do not need their name at the top of anything to know the value of what they've built. They build because the building is real, and they protect because the people are real, and they wait because they understand that time does not favor the performance. It favors the actual. And the Ethan Caldwells of the world, the ones who mistake the performance for substance, who build their sense of reality out of how many people are watching, they never see it coming. They look at a quiet woman and see nothing worth looking at. They mistake patience for weakness and precision for passivity and depth for absence. They take everything that's been quietly holding them up and call it nothing, and then one day the nothing stops, and they learn too late what it had actually been. He had been one of those men. He was trying, with partial success and genuine effort, to be something different. He was not certain he would fully make it. He was not certain there was a fully made it available to him or to anyone. People do not arrive. They move, imperfectly, toward something that keeps receding slightly as they approach it, and the movement is the point. What he knew was this. He had stood at the edge of a life that had been built on what other people confirmed about him, and he had watched it dissolve, and he had found out what remained when the confirmation was gone. What remained had not been much in the beginning. It had been enough to start with. He had started with it. The rest was the work. He walked north through the July afternoon, his jacket over his arm, the sun warm on his face, and Chicago went around him the way it always had. Indifferent, permanent, full of every kind of story, everyone moving through it toward whatever they were moving toward. He was part of it in a way that didn't require an audience. The city did not care who he had been. Neither did he, any more particularly. He cared about the assessment he owed Emily by September 1st. He cared about the Michigan plastics manufacturer and what its balance sheet was hiding. He cared about Kevin Park and whether Kevin knew yet what he was capable of. He cared about getting home and taking the third yellow legal pad from the nightstand and writing something true. He turned the corner and the lake opened up at the end of the street, blue and enormous, going all the way to the horizon and beyond it to wherever water goes when you can't see it anymore. And he stood for a moment and looked at it the way he had looked at it every season for 3 years, from every weather and every hour, and it had not changed at all, and he had changed considerably, and the lake was entirely unimpressed by either of those facts. He found that, for reasons he could not have predicted 3 years ago, standing in a different window, looking down at this same city, deeply comforting. He put his jacket back on against the lake wind and walked home.